All right, well, let's get started. Hello and welcome everyone to this presentation of Solutions for Utility Data Access, being presented to the Maryland Building Energy Performance Standard Utility Working Group. My name is Andrew Schulte, and I am a consultant with ICF, providing implementation support to EPA's ENERGY STAR program. I have supported the ENERGY STAR program for 18 and a half years, and I am conversant in a number of topics related to benchmarking, the use of Portfolio Manager, the use of the Portfolio Manager application programming interface, and in general, the concept and topic of utility data access to support commercial and multifamily building owners in obtaining the whole building energy data that they need to benchmark their buildings. So this meeting is the second webinar, or the second time we will have presented as ENERGY STAR to this group. We met before on June 3rd, and during that call, the ENERGY STAR team provided kind of a high-level overview of what we consider our guidance on best practices for utility data access solutions. It was a series of 8 best practices that we walked through at a high level and then had some good discussion on, at the end of the presentation. At the request of MDE, we have decided to kind of do what we're calling a deep dive on a few specific topics that ended up garnering some feedback, some additional questions from utilities after that June 3rd call. This is the first round of items where we think there may be the most technical questions or conceptual questions from the utilities, the Maryland utilities, and so we just want to make sure that we're, as it says here, diving in a little deeper on these to provide you the information you need to scope out and plan for your solution, or as needed to come back to the ENERGY STAR team with further questions. So those deep dive topics include what you see here. First, we're going to touch on the concept of meter to building mapping, which is probably the single biggest element that will need to be worked through for utilities that are going to be providing a whole building aggregated data solution. We're also going to talk a little bit about the importance of gross as opposed to net consumption of energy data for those buildings that have on-site renewable energy generation. This is a little bit more of a niche topic. It won't be applicable in all cases, but it is something that we think you should be aware of at the outset. Then we're going to dive into the final 2 sections are going to be talking about different delivery mechanisms for the aggregate whole building energy data that you will be compiling on behalf of requesters. The first is the Portfolio Manager Web Services API, which is a requirement for under the BEPS law for utilities above a certain size. And then we will also talk about the spreadsheet approach to data delivery, which is available to smaller utilities who, according to the law, have the option of whether to deliver data via spreadsheet or through a more direct API solution. And we'll talk about the differences between those 2 approaches. And for those utilities that might find themselves kind of on the bubble in terms of which option to use, we can provide a few other thoughts as to which we believe provides the most value. We'll end up, we'll just have a very short wrap up where we'll provide some links and resources and contact information for anyone on the ENERGY STAR team that you'd like to follow up with. Certainly, as we move out of these working group presentations, and as each utility starts diving into the solutions that they will be building out individually, that's a perfect point at which we would be happy to provide any assistance we can in terms of the the scoping or development as you go through that process. So we see today not as, the only time you'll hear from us, but, we want today to be an invitation to all the utilities on the line to, reach back out to us as, more questions pop up as you move through this process. All right, so introduction over. Let's dive into the good stuff. So here we go. Let's touch on the first of our deep dive topics, which, as I noted, is meter to building mapping. All right, so let's just make sure that we're all on the same page as to what the real issue is here. So as we discussed on June 3rd, the whole point of whole building data aggregation is that it's a mechanism by which utilities can provide the data needed to benchmark to the building owner who needs to do the benchmarking and the reporting to the state. But that the information that's provided by the utility to the building owner does not run afoul of any privacy considerations, especially and most notably when we're talking about large multi-family or multi-tenant properties. And of course, the issue in that situation is that the entity required to do the benchmarking and report to the state often will not actually have access to all of the energy data that's consumed at the tenant or resident level. And therefore, that's where the utility aggregate data solution comes in to ensure that the building owner can have what they need to benchmark in EPA's portfolio manager tool, but doesn't have anything they're not supposed to have, like tenant level energy consumption data. So when we're talking about aggregation, the big issue that we need to keep in mind is that providing aggregate data in and of itself is not the whole deal, right? It's probably, well, I'll go so far as to say it's not going to be enough to get a request from a building owner and then just send them back a number, right? Because obviously there's a lot that goes on here. You can see this this diagram or picture that I've set up. I mean, basically, there's a process of identifying the individual or constituent meters or accounts or service points that are associated with a given property, rolling them all up into an aggregate total, and then providing that total to the building owner so that they can get into portfolio manager. The thing here, though, is that aggregation process, it can't just be a black box, right? If a customer makes a request and then all of a sudden, a week or 2 weeks or however long later, a consumption value shows up in their portfolio manager account, I mean, that's certainly great, but at no point in the process will the building owner know for sure how accurate those data are, right? So even though aggregation is critical in protecting the privacy of individual tenants' data, it is equally as important that the building owners who are receiving the aggregate data have some ability to validate that the aggregate consumption values that they're being provided are correct and are complete. So what are some processes that can help to maybe not open, the black box in the middle, right? Because you're never going to be providing building owners with, tenant level data that hasn't been pre-approved. But what can you provide to the building owner so that they feel confident that the aggregate value they've been provided is in fact the complete and total energy consumption for their property for a given period? So the process of data aggregation, when we talk about actually getting under the hood of the utility data system, whether you're, looking into your billing system or, some more granular, downstream system, that is going to be specific. The technical, the technical steps that a utility has to take to get from individual meter consumption data to aggregate whole building meter consumption data is really going to depend on the utility systems themselves. So I don't want to suggest that this is in any way a prescriptive checklist for what you need to do. Rather, this is kind of a high-level process for what needs to happen through the data aggregation process. So, the first is that the utility working with the building owner who's requesting the data needs to make sure that they understand the property for which data is being requested. And that requires having a process for identifying the actual physical extent of the property, and identifying any existing utility meters or service points or whatever other measurement points you may have that are associated with that location. In a perfect world, what's also happening is that not only is the utility identifying these parts that make up the whole, but then they would be able to come back to the data requester and provide some basic information about what parts have been identified and that roll up to the whole. Now, to be clear, nothing about this suggests that the utility should ever release tenant level data to a building owner who doesn't have the authorization for those data. Rather, the idea here is that the utility would provide a list of service addresses or account names or something else that the building owner could go and compare against their rent roll or their stacking plan to say, yeah, you've identified all the parts that make up my building. Once that back and forth has happened and both parties feel confident that all of the constituent meters have been identified, then those are rolled up on the back end through a technical process that would probably be coded, and those individual constituent meters would become rolled up into an aggregate or virtual consumption record, which could then be sent to the building owner. And the important thing to note here is that doing this, what we call meter to building mapping, is probably going to be you're probably going to spend the most time on this that first time the building owner requests their data. However, we know that multi-tenant buildings are not static, right? Tenants, residents turnover frequently, and therefore it is important to also have a process to make sure that at any given point in time, your system is able to identify all of those metered points that should be included in aggregate whole building data. And if that requires, updating the meter to building mapping over time, that is something you're going to want to think through as part of your solution features. Now, this is one example that maybe will bring this all home a little bit more in terms of how we've seen this work with other utilities. I call this portal-based mapping because this is a common feature that we see with utilities that have opted to develop their own standalone portals for data access. There are any number of ways to do that. And we can talk about the pros and cons and alternatives, in one-on-one discussions. But let's just take as a given for a minute that, this is a hypothetical utility that is exposing their meter to building mapping process through a customer-facing portal. And the general idea here, we've mocked up a very simple building which has 4 tenants and then, a building owner that pays the bill for the base building and common area space. And so the idea here is that in an idealized scenario, the building owner for 123 Main Street would come to the utility and say, hey, I need help obtaining my aggregate whole building data. Generally speaking, the utility will have some limited number of upfront questions, right? They might say, all right, give us your primary building address. They might also say, this is best practice. The utility might also say, if you have any alternate addresses for this building, please provide. What do I mean by alternate address? Let's say you're a building located at a street corner, a downtown office building located at a street corner, and you have an entrance at 123 Main Street and 456 Broad Street. In that case, running your search on all meters or accounts associated with 123 Main Street might not be sufficient because some number of tenants in your building might have a billing address of 456 Broad Street. So obviously, it's important to know that and get that information from the building owner so that you can run queries in your system appropriately. But let's just say for a second it's a building with one Main Street address. So the utility runs 123 Main Street through its database or billing system or whatever the data source of record is, and the utility system will do that lookup and will return a list of the individual tenants or accounts that it has associated with 123 Main Street, and would present it to the building owner in such a way that the building owner can go through and confirm or deny, any individual pieces that have been identified. So in this case, again, an idealized example, the utility system has returned, 5 different suite addresses located at 123 Main Street, and the building owners come in here and check them and says, yes, those are tenants at my property. And then there's one other building from, across the street around the corner. For some reason, 124 Broad Street got brought in. We know that data queries can be fuzzy. This happens. Well, in that case, the building owner would be able to say, nope, not at my building. Let's uncheck that. And similarly, if they don't see a tenant listed, there would be an option for them to note that. But what's important here is you are kind of sharing the load. The utility is, and their system queries are taking the first step in identifying essentially the pieces that make up the whole from an energy consumption perspective for this building, but it is still the responsibility of the data requester to actually review those initial findings and help the utility kind of fine-tune that list. So even though we would consider this utility-led meter-to-building mapping, what we want to make clear is it is absolutely appropriate and in almost all cases essential for the building owner to have an active role in confirming that the utility has identified all the all the constituent points of energy consumption for their building. Now, we talked about this a little bit on June 3rd, but I want to reiterate this here. It's, meter to building mapping itself is very important, but it's also really important to document that meter to building mapping. So, as I said earlier, if the building owner makes a request and then just gets a value, an aggregate consumption value, certainly that's a lot of the process. That's very valuable, but they need to know that the correct pieces have been identified, and that any given aggregate consumption value correctly represents all points of energy consumption in the building. So the point here is that it's not just fulfill the request and provide the data. It's also important to provide what we have been referring to as an itemized receipt, right? Or some sort of documentation that the owner can see and can access on demand at any given point in time to view, review, and confirm that the utility is correctly identifying, the parts that need to make up the whole. This is, obviously this should have been, you should have this information based on that, initial meter to building mapping. But this is also critical in ensuring that, over time, the building owner or anybody else looking at the building data can feel confident that the meter to building mapping and aggregation is continuing to perform as it should. Now, this is a snapshot from the Portfolio Manager tool. There is functionality in Portfolio Manager today that allows you to indicate that that a given meter object in Portfolio Manager is an aggregate meter. And if you indicate that, you then have the ability to provide additional breakout documentation of what are the pieces that make up the whole. And so this is just a screenshot of the table that's provided in Portfolio Manager and the kinds of information that would be collected there. Certainly, if a utility is building out its own data aggregation portal or working with a vendor whose solution already contains this itemized receipt functionality, as part of its platform, you're not required to use the Portfolio Manager functionality. But we wanted to share this because, many utilities don't even know or don't have any way of sort of conceptualizing what we mean when we say itemized receipt. And so we wanted to throw this out there as a point of reference. And it's certainly something that we'd be happy to discuss with you in greater detail in one-on-one calls. All right, so the next topic that I wanted to discuss is the issue of gross versus net consumption for properties that have on-site renewable energy generation, and moreover are interconnected with the grid, and therefore are able to sell back any excess on-site generation to the utility. There's a lot of words here, so you'll have the opportunity to read this while I talk, but at a high level, what portfolio manager needs, and therefore what utilities need to provide as part of the aggregated data consumption data value, is gross grid electricity consumption. Right now, we know that in cases where customers are set up, they're interconnected, with the grid, and they're selling back excess on-site generation. We know that the net metered consumption is an important construct for billing purposes, right? The net consumption represents, what the customer consumed from the grid, less, the amount that they sold back to the grid. It's a very important billing construct, but I think the important thing that is easy to overlook sometimes is that just because a customer is getting credited for sellback of renewable energy to the grid, it doesn't mean that the actual consumption of grid electricity didn't happen, right? So your net metered consumption quantity for a given month for a given customer might be zero, or it might be negative, but that doesn't actually mean that the customer didn't consume grid electricity during that time. And because of the way Portfolio Manager works, it is critical that you not only identify all energy consumed in the operation of the building, but also that you can that the user and the Portfolio Manager tool can correctly distinguish between grid kilowatt hours and on-site renewable kilowatt hours, because there are implications in terms of energy efficiency metrics as well as greenhouse gas metrics. So in short, we recognize that a lot of utilities might be prioritizing the net consumption value on their invoices, or maybe their billing system only deals with net consumption. But the important thing to note here is that that's not going to be sufficient for Portfolio Manager, right? It's gross consumption that needs to be captured in aggregate whole building data. And so even if the utility's billing system is the bottom line number is net consumption, assuming that there is that outgoing flow that was netted out, assuming that value exists in your billing system, even if it's not presented on the bills, it's important to provide that to the building owner, if you're not able to actually gross up the value itself before sending it through. There are some cases, which we'll discuss in a minute, where actually the limitation is not, just what's captured in the billing system, but it may actually come down to the metering technology itself. So we'll switch over to that to talk about that in just a moment. But I do want to say that, as after listening to this presentation, we do encourage utilities to, if necessary, ask some questions, do some research as to how their billing system is currently handling the consumption that's reported for buildings with on-site renewable. This graphic here is one that shows, the various energy flows that are relevant to Portfolio Manager. The thing that we want to call out here is that, the total energy used to operate the building that needs to be entered into Portfolio Manager by your customers is the sum of G, all grid energy that was received by the building, and any renewable energy that was generated on site and used on site. Okay. if your billing system is calculating a net value, then what it means is, in a lot of cases, it means that somewhere within your metering system, you know, the math done was G minus, you know, energy exported to the grid, right? So G minus R sub X gets you to net. Now, the real question here is, how many channels do your meters have? And are those actually two metered streams for which the data can be surfaced? We know that there are different types of so-called different types of meters with different functionalities and capabilities when it comes to interconnection between the building and the grid. We know that there are actual meters that are just known as net meters. And in this case, net energy consumption is not actually just a billing construct, but it is truly what is measured by the meter, right? These are meters where when energy is coming into the building, the meter runs forward. When energy is being exported to the grid, the meter runs backwards. So there's only one channel and there's only one value, and that one value will always and only be net. So this is a case where, I think if this is you, if this reflects your utility and the meters that you have in place at your customers' buildings, this is something that you should identify now. And this is something that we should probably discuss a little bit further, because yeah, there may be some special considerations or workarounds that need to be communicated to your customer to help them benchmark their building accurately and adequately. In a lot of cases, especially where AMI infrastructure has been rolled out, we know that you've got either bidirectional meters or perhaps even dual meters in place, and that is where you actually have the ability to discretely monitor and track the incoming and outgoing flows of data into and out of the building. So what this means is, utilities that have bidirectional meters, if they're only reporting net consumption on the customer bill, obviously that's because some math would have already been done. That G minus R sub X would have been performed either within the billing system or before the billing system, so that net consumption value could be provided to the customer. In this situation, you have the technological ability to capture the data flows that you need. The important thing here to ask is whether or not your billing system is actually capturing and taking note of that, right? Because if the net calculation is done before it even flows up to your billing system, and if you're using your billing system as the source of truth for your data access solution, well, in that case, you've just lost some important information. So the question there would be, where does that actual mathematical netting happen? Where is the point in your system where you have both streams of data? And if can you take that net number and add back in the R sub EX number, or can you make sure that if you're pushing a net consumption value to your customer, that you're also providing them in some way that outgoing opposite stream, so that they can do the math on their own. Again, the importance here is understanding the nature of the technical metering infrastructure that you have, as well as where these data are housed in your system, and the level of granularity at which they are available. Because just to put another bottom line on this, you need to be providing gross energy consumption to your customer, which ends up being not just net, but the sum of net plus any kilowatt hours that were generated on site and sold back to the grid. This can be a pretty, this is a pretty nuanced topic, and I expect that, every utility is going to have a different scenario, or, slightly different scenarios of, how they need to deal with this. So this is absolutely something that we'd be willing and able to talk with you about offline, to dig in and try and, troubleshoot or figure out what the most appropriate approach could be. Okay, well, those were two pretty large topics that are sort of more high level and conceptual and a little bit fuzzy even, because there aren't necessarily, straightforward answers in terms of you should do, if you do steps 1 through 6, then you've done everything you need to do, right? Those first two deep dives are topics that are gonna require further discussion, further exploration, further discussion with your, IT and data teams. The next two topics that we want to talk about are aligned with how you actually get the data to your customers. And these are, I like to think, a little bit more straightforward. So the first one that we're going to discuss is the Portfolio Manager Web Services API. And, we'll talk in just a minute about what a API is and a few other technical details. But in essence, the Portfolio Manager API is a mechanism for one entity that has data in their database to send it through to Portfolio Manager directly. So essentially your system, your utility system, can reach in and put the right consumption value in the right meter object in your customer's Portfolio Manager record. Rather than, a spreadsheet-based approach, which we'll discuss later, where you do all the meter to building mapping and aggregation, and then you provide the data to the customer in the spreadsheet for them to load into Portfolio Manager. So essentially, if you're using the API, the customer goes through the request process and provides all the information that you need to do your meter to building mapping, and then when it's time to actually transfer the data over to the customer, it's being done through these web service calls. The important thing here is that the Portfolio Manager API is not just used for a one-time delivery of data. It can be used to provide ongoing monthly updates. And so essentially what this means is once the building owner gets synced up to you with this service, they will receive, a first time, delivery of some amount of historical data, whether that's 12 or 24 or 36 months. And then without having to do anything further on a monthly basis, as new aggregate consumption data becomes available, your system can be set up to automatically push that gross aggregate consumption number right through into the customer's Portfolio Manager account without them having to request it. I also want to note, we'll talk about this a little bit later, that the API, the way that you execute the handshake between the utility system and the customer means that there's a two-way connection between the utility and the customer's Portfolio Manager account, which means that not only are you sending data to them, but if this is something that you want to do, you have the ability to also see data in their Portfolio Manager account and pull back that information. And we can talk a little bit further in this presentation about why that might be desirable. But let's talk a little bit more about the technical details of the Portfolio Manager API. In general, our application programming interface, or API, is a suite of web services that allow utilities to exchange data directly with Portfolio Manager. Essentially, this is allowing you to take on the role of, or to take on responsibility for certain data entry processes that would otherwise have to be performed manually by your customer. Really, this facilitates automation and delivery of benchmarking data at scale. And with a few exceptions, our API exposes, and makes it possible to perform basically all functions that a customer sitting in front of their computer would have been able to do through the online user interface. In terms of technical details, I suspect that many of you may be sharing this presentation with your IT departments. In short, our API uses a REST-based protocol. All calls are made using basic HTML methods, get, put, post, and delete. I did want to note that all outgoing web service calls and responses will be formatted in XML. We commonly get the question of whether JSON is acceptable as formatting, and I would note that at this point in time, Portfolio Manager does not support JSON. So all payloads that are either being sent or received as part of your web service call will need to be formatted in XML. Also wanted to make clear that the ENERGY STAR team, does not, and truthfully cannot, from a resource perspective, provide one-on-one support for the actual development of code. So our expectation is that, we provide the API, we provide the documentation, we provide the troubleshooting and, technical support. But in terms of the actual build out of the solution, the coding, the programming, the integration with your data systems, that's something that needs to be done either by your utilities IT department, or if you so choose, through a third-party vendor, which is, an acceptable option as well. We provide a lot of documentation for our API. So here's just a screenshot of the main page. I think the link to it is later on in this presentation, but you can always find it by just doing a quick Google on Portfolio Manager Web Services API. This documentation provides all of the APIs for both our live and our test environment, all XML schemas needed to understand what well-formed calls look like. There are example requests and responses for every single web service call. And then we also have supporting documentation like release notes and guidance documents and maintenance schedules. All right, the next 3 slides I am not going to go through in detail, but they are available to you in the PDF version of these slides that I believe MDE will be making available. A lot of utilities ask us, okay, what is the cadence of the web service calls? We know you have an API, but how do you put it all together to deliver the data that's needed? So what we've done here, again, this stretches across 3 slides, but we have really tried to do a step-by-step process to identify in a typical utility web services or API-based data access solution, who is doing what when. Okay, so each line in these charts identifies a specific action, who is taking that action, and then where relevant, if it involves an API call, what API call is that? Or if there's no API call needed, what is the action that is taking place in the Portfolio Manager user interface? I believe that all of the API call links in this table should be hyperlinked, and that should make it through the PDF that you're provided. If not, let us know, and we can provide you a version with links. But in short, this walks through the whole process, and really the majority of these calls are going to be oriented around the initial handshake that the utility establishes with the data requester, with their customer. There's a lot of call and response there. It's Portfolio Manager refers to it as the connection and sharing phase. So customer makes a request, utility reviews request, utility approves request. So there's a stepwise process needed to establish that initial handshake. But once that handshake is established, as I said earlier, the pipeline is open between your system and your customer's Portfolio Manager account, meaning that you can start piping through data, on an automated basis without requiring subsequent requests. So yeah, as you can see here, there's a lot of, customer makes request, utility reviews request, utility accepts request. You go through that cadence a few times, and at the end of all this, what you have is a utility who is set up to push data to the customer's building. Nothing in our API dictates how a utility should or must perform the meter to building mapping that we talked about earlier. That is a challenge that will need to be addressed and solved by the utility itself, because it's going to be highly dependent on what your existing data systems are, what your existing tools are for querying that data system. The idea here is that there's a point in this process where the utility goes ahead and does the aggregation of data and does the review and validation with the customer. The idea here is once that's all done, you've got 12 months or more of aggregate data that you can then push through to your customer. And in fact, by this point in the process, it's truly just a simple call. It's a post consumption data call to the specified meter object in Portfolio Manager. So, we definitely encourage you to share these details with your IT team. In general, we have heard, a lot of complimentary feedback on our documentation. We hope that your experience is the same. Certainly, if there's anything that's confusing or that you feel is missing, we'd love to hear that from you. But we do feel like, the API documentation itself should put an IT team in a pretty good position to move ahead. But of course, if there's any need to discuss, what are the right API calls? What's the right combination? How do you suggest packaging them up into a workflow? We're always happy to talk about that. I mentioned earlier that we had some thoughts about whether the API or the spreadsheet was the preferred pathway. Certainly it's gonna come down to whether the utility, based on its size, has the choice of using the API versus using the spreadsheet. And if it has the opportunity to use the spreadsheet, you'll need to consider whether the added effort needed to build out an API solution is something that you want to take on. But I do want to be clear that all else being equal, we do feel that the API method of data delivery is a more complete solution, because it's not just a one-time, one-way delivery of data. It really allows you to set up that channel through which ongoing monthly aggregate consumption data can be sent to your customer's portfolio manager record. And also, as we noted earlier, the API connection isn't just a one-way push of data to your customer. In fact, it does allow that return data stream, which would allow you to, if you so chose, to get more information about the performance of your customer's building as a whole, as opposed to just a collection of accounts. All right, so with that in mind, we're going to close this session out by talking about some key points about spreadsheet-based solutions for those utilities that are allowed to use this approach under the BEPS law, and who determine that this is the approach that makes the most sense for them, usually based on the number of requests for aggregate whole building data that they expect to need to fulfill. And of course, that's going to be based on the number of buildings in a utility service territory that are expected to be on the covered buildings list, and therefore likely to seek your assistance in obtaining whole building aggregate data. So again, the general process flow for the spreadsheet-based delivery process, the initial data request is going to be the same thing, right? You still have to figure out a process for doing the, for performing the meter to building mapping and the identification of all of the constituent points that make up whole building consumption data. However, once you have that, the way of getting it to the customer is you're going to put it in a spreadsheet, and you're either going to email it to your customer, or you're going to make it available in a portal from which they can download it. The key point there is once the customer has it, it's on them to get it into Portfolio Manager, right? They are the middleman in this process. They take the data they receive from you, and they upload it into Portfolio Manager. In some cases, this could be just a quick, select and upload a file. In other cases, it might require copying and pasting or rekeying. But again, the critical point here is that it does put the building owner, the data requester, in the middle. That is a task they have to perform. Also, this process lends itself most directly to kind of one-time provision of data. So in this case, building owner makes a request, utility fulfills the request, utility sends the data, case closed until next year when the requester asks for the data again. More importantly, because there is no ongoing two-way API connection, the utility doesn't have any visibility into the customer's benchmarking results. If all you're doing is sending your customer data and they put it into their Portfolio Manager account, it's out of sight, out of mind for you, the utility. Or rather, you have no way of seeing the end result of their benchmarking efforts unless you explicitly seek to set up such a pathway. which is also something we could discuss if that's of interest. But that is a key difference. The spreadsheet-based delivery approach is very much geared towards individual transactions. Now, a lot of people want to know, well, what's the correct format for delivering data to customers? And the answer for this is, if you are familiar with Portfolio Manager, or you're able to set up your own test account, if you go in at the meter level, there is, for every meter type, there is a corresponding, and you can see here, it's called the single meter spreadsheet. Okay, and this is a really simple spreadsheet. The idea is that you download it, you fill it in, and then you upload it back to Portfolio Manager, and Portfolio Manager accepts those consumption data, and it's quicker and easier than hand entering in data. So Portfolio Manager has a couple different templates. So there's one for electricity, there's one for non-electric metered fuels. So those would be things like natural gas, water, anything else that has a ongoing delivery, that is tracked on an ongoing basis by a meter. If you are responsible for providing any sorts of bulk fuels like fuel oil or diesel or anything that happens in discrete deliveries, they have their own meter object type in Portfolio Manager, and therefore there is a specific spreadsheet for capturing those data. But if that applies to you, let us know and we can talk about it. But the thing I want to point out, this is a quick snapshot of the template for electricity, and the thing that I really want to make clear is the data required to push to Portfolio Manager is actually pretty straightforward. For electricity, start date, end date, usage quantity. Now, cost is optional, demand is optional, and by default, Portfolio Manager is going to assume that any value is not an estimation. It's a real number. So really, what you need to provide to your customer is, for each billing period, what was the start date, what was the end date, and what was the total aggregate consumption for the building. This is pretty straightforward, and you can see that for the metered non-electric fuels, it's even easier because it's not taking into account issues of demand. So the information you need to gather is pretty straightforward. Now, can you simply take one of these spreadsheets and download it, and download a blank copy and just make it, build it into your system, and it will be used as the standard template for delivering aggregate consumption data to your customers? You can, but please note that EPA does make minor updates to spreadsheet formatting, data validation, and whatnot, from time to time, and those are not announced. So it is possible that if you were to download these spreadsheets to, put in the back end of your system for generating spreadsheets for your customers, I mean, it's possible that when they go back into Portfolio Manager, the data, the template could be outdated, and therefore the select and upload functionality would not work. Something, at this point in time, there is no single spreadsheet template that will always and forever, be accepted by Portfolio Manager. At this level, it is something we're talking about and considering whether that is an enhancement that could be made. But the point here is, if you plan to download these spreadsheet templates and actually integrate them programmatically into your solution, it would be important to remember that from time to time you probably do need to check and refresh and download the latest version of the template, because they are pretty sensitive in terms of data format and whatnot. And if you're having issues with this, there are additional approaches or workarounds that we'd be happy to discuss. As we just discussed, the data format can be pretty straightforward, right? Start date, end date, consumption quantity. You do that for a minimum of 12 monthly periods, initially, and then, you've given the user what they need to benchmark their building. However, a lot of the solutions that were discussed as part of our best practices guidance are things that maybe don't lend themselves as well to a spreadsheet solution, or don't lend themselves as immediately to a spreadsheet solution. So something like ongoing delivery of monthly data, or handling any rebills or corrections or revisions to data you've already provided the customer, or documenting the meter to building mapping. Those are all things that you can absolutely do using a spreadsheet-based approach, but if you're not using the API, it's not as simple, right? So those are best practices. And if you're using a spreadsheet-based approach, you will need to consider how to deliver those best practices using a spreadsheet. And again, something that we'd be happy to go into greater detail with you on one-on-one calls. I did want to note that earlier in this presentation, I shared a screen of what it looks like in the functionality in Portfolio Manager that allows you to document meter to building mapping. That functionality is available manually, so the building user can type it in, and it's also available via API. But if you're providing a spreadsheet of aggregate whole building data to your customer, just be aware that you will need to provide them that itemized receipt, right? So shown here is just a spreadsheet version of the data that's collected in Portfolio Manager. So we think that, at a minimum, when you provide your customer an aggregate whole building consumption data spreadsheet, you should also, maybe in a separate tab, also be providing the necessary documentation that shows what are all the parts that rolled up to that aggregate whole. If this doesn't seem clear based on this explanation, again, happy to talk with you offline. But again, this is one of these things where there's no immediate, ready-baked solution for spreadsheet-based delivery. This is something that, in order to align with this best practice, you will need to, think about how to deliver this information to your customer along with the aggregate consumption data itself. All right, so that got us to the end of today's deep dive, and our wrap up and next steps here is actually just a quick slide or two. If you have not yet had the opportunity to review our guidance for utilities on providing whole building energy data, which was the topic of our June 3rd presentation, we do encourage you to access that document and start reviewing it, because it provides some really important high-level guidelines for what we believe utilities should be striving to deliver as part of their solution. As I've said multiple times during this call, we are ready, willing, and able to talk with each and every one of you one-on-one, to brainstorm, to think through, pose solutions that you've identified. We want to make sure that we can help you with your questions, to do whatever we can on the ENERGY STAR side to ensure that your ultimate aggregate data solution is as complete and customer friendly as possible. So there are a number of things we can do. Again, like I said, we're not going to be able to go in and troubleshoot code, or we're not going to be able to write your programming for you. But there's a lot of other both technical and strategic support that we can provide. So we do encourage you to reach out. And this spreadsheet provides some contact information for the EPA team members who are part of the engagement with MDE and with utilities across the country. There's my information as well if you want to follow up with me. And as a general rule, if you have a question and you have the time to do this, take a look at our help desk. There is a whole set of keyword searchable FAQs that probably will answer a large number of technical questions about Portfolio Manager. But also, if there's a question that you have that's not answered there, there's also a form for you to submit your own question. So that's it for today. I believe that the next scheduled working group call will be August 15th. So we look forward to speaking with you then. In the meantime, thanks so much for your time and attention today. We hope this information has been useful. Obviously, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, We look forward to receiving that, and we certainly look forward to providing whatever support we can in helping you to stand up your whole building aggregate data access solutions. So from the ENERGY STAR team, I will say thanks very much, and I will close out the session for today. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.